Hello, Dr. Wes here with episode 1 of Natural Primary Care. We're here on the YouTube channel, Natural Primary Care on the YouTube channel, and I'm just going to jump right into this. This is the first episode. We're done with the intro. That's a big relief because that's the one that causes the most anxiety. So, if you saw the intro video, we talked a little bit about comprehensive medicine and talked about building a coalition to try to shift the medical paradigm. But before we get into that, let's just talk a little bit about TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, what it is and what it isn't. The roots of TCM go back 5,000 years at least. The essence of TCM is herbal medicine. Now, we can certainly imagine that well before 5000 BC, all the way back into our distant past, plants, certain particular herbs and stuff would have been ingested, and over time, people, hominids even perhaps, would have noticed, oh, if you eat this particular grass, it may have a certain effect. If you have an upset stomach, maybe go eat some of this particular grass and you'll feel better. And that's really maybe the roots of herbal medicine, and that goes back, I don't know, 50,000 years. I mean, who knows? So it's sort of built into us to look to plants for our medicines. Now, in terms of traditional Chinese medicine, there's some discussion, shall we say, about the actual roots of it. Some people make a definite connection to the ancient Ayurvedic canon, which is, roughly the same time period. My way of thinking is that there was certainly probably some influence there, but the difference between traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine is quite distinct. Traditional Chinese medicine is absolutely without any competitors in terms of natural herbal medicine. And the reasons for that will become clear as we go along here. Not today necessarily, but just keep watching the videos and eventually you will see what I'm talking about here. So the essence, the basis of traditional Chinese medicine can in many ways be boiled down to a simple concept. Now, most people have seen this and are familiar with the Tai Chi symbol. Some people call it a Tai Chi symbol. Tai Chi. It's a symbol. If you look at this symbol, it's really an archetypal symbol. It's a symbol that resonates with something within us. When you look at this symbol, you immediately have a sense of motion, a sense of circularity, a sense of rhythm, a sense of spinning, if you will. The black dot within the white fish, some people call them fish, the white dot within the black fish also carry meaning. So this symbol, which we call the Tai Chi symbol, is basically showing us the yin and the yang. Now, just a quick brief word here on Chinese pronunciation, pinyin, and my horrible Chinese pronunciation. Better than some, I think. Everybody, I say everybody, most people are familiar with the term yin and yang. This is how it is often pronounced, yin and yang. particularly in the southern United States. It is more correctly pronounced yin and yang. Yin, yang. Now, when you study Chinese medicine, you are immediately confronted with a lot of Chinese terms, names, and such. And it's written in English letters, but it's when you just speak it, it's supposed to approximate Chinese. They call this pinyin writing. Now, it's a little bit different than what it looks like to maybe some English speakers, because the original pinyin was actually done in Russian with Cyrillic letters, and then the modern pinyin is derived from that. So when you see Y-I-N, yin, or in, Y-A-N-G, yang, not yang, there's a lot of room for mispronunciation there. And Chinese is a very subtle, nuanced language. And so I apologize to all the Chinese speakers out there who are going to cringe at my pinyin pronunciations. But they were good enough to get me through school, so there you have it. Okay, having covered that, talked a little bit about the ancient past of herbal medicine. Just briefly want to touch also on acupuncture, which is really the thing that people think about when they think about traditional Chinese medicine. They think about acupuncture. And as I said in the intro video, we are commonly referred to as acupuncturists. And we refer to ourselves as acupuncturists quite often. Acupuncture is a very interesting subject. It's very esoteric. It is one aspect of traditional Chinese medicine that Western science, Western medicine looks at and has some problems with in terms of the science of it, the function of it. And so, as I said, interesting subject, kind of a difficult subject to speak of in modern scientific ways, but as we go down the road here, I will attempt to do so and make clear at least my thoughts about what acupuncture is, how it functions. And of course, when you think about acupuncture, you also think about this meridian system. Many people have seen the diagrams of the human body with the little lines and the dots, the meridians and acupuncture points. Also something that sometimes Western science has a little problem with. And we're going to talk about the politics of medicine, and in the context of that, we're certainly going to talk about the negative politics of TCM. If you go to the Wikipedia page on traditional Chinese medicine or acupuncture, I can't remember exactly which one, it is right off the bat a spin. And I'm actually working to try to correct that. But right off the bat, you see the term pseudoscience a couple of times right at the very top of the page. And acupuncture might be a little difficult to understand from a Western perspective. We might have trouble identifying the structures and the mechanisms that are involved in the process, but it is definitely not pseudoscience. And so when I see things like that, and I think a lot of practitioners think this as well, just because we notice it, when you see that, you automatically think that there is someone who is actively trying to poo-poo the concept of acupuncture, say, which then leads you to the conclusion that someone out there has a vested interest in de-promoting and denigrating traditional Chinese medicine. The only people that really come to mind that might have that vested interest are the pharmaceutical companies. And there's a lot of theories, conspiracy theories, if you will, in the acupuncture community about who does that, why it's done, how it's done, etc., and also how to push back against that. Because if you think about it, if you're in the business of making pharmaceuticals and you have a rising framework over here, a rising practice of herbal medicine that allows many people to either reduce or eliminate their pharmaceutical medicines, you perceive that as a threat. So a lot of us, I think, have the idea that we've just been under this subtle media attack for a number of years, a couple of decades at least, from the pharmaceutical companies. It's a very, very difficult thing to prove, of course, but it's the sort of thing that when you see it, you know it, you recognize it, you go, oh, this Wikipedia page was written by somebody who has a vested interest in denigrating traditional Chinese medicine. Any practitioners out there who are eloquent and have a good science background, feel free to go to Wikipedia and weigh in and help me try to get them to change that, because let's face it, for all of its faults, Wikipedia is a very, very popular place for people to get information. But you have to be very careful about the information and consider its source. Okay, enough of that. We're going to move on from acupuncture. I just want to say one thing. Acupuncture, I mean, we're talking about something that also goes back a long way. Before acupuncture, there would have been acupressure. And everybody has the experience of having a sore spot, or you have a tight back and you reach back and you're rubbing it and you find one little spot there where there's a knot, spasm or something, and when you press it, it's painful, but you also get a sense of relief. Quite often, those points are indeed actual acupuncture points. Sometimes they're just sore points. The Japanese call them ashir points. It's not an acupuncture point, but it is a point that is tender. So acupressure, pressing on that point, or pressing on a number of points, can actually relieve tightness, pain, and eventually some wise little individual had the idea that maybe it would be a good idea to puncture these things. People talk about, oh, well, it goes back to the idea that you wanted to puncture to release the evil spirits. And, nobody knows. I mean, maybe that was the mindset. There's certainly a lot of ancient, what we perhaps now consider fluffy spiritual ideas about traditional medicine. More on that later. So even some of the very early acupuncture techniques would have been just a perfectly natural sort of thing to do. You have a sore spot, press it, rub it. It kind of hurts when you do it, but then afterwards it feels better. And they probably use things like fish bones or maybe some tree thorns or something. I've seen pictures of very early acupuncture needles once it was codified and became acupuncture, and some of them are pretty scary looking. By the way, acupuncture needles are very, 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 very thin, fine needles. You really don't feel them, really. It's not like a hypodermic needle. Acupuncture needles will fit up inside hypodermic needles. That's how fine they are. So people who are worried about needles or afraid of needles and are interested in acupuncture, it's fine. It's not really maybe what you think it is. As I said, acupuncture is kind of a deep and sort of a strange thing to talk about to people who don't really understand what it is. So we're going to be saving that for the most part. So really the heart of Chinese medicine is really the herbal component. And another thing about Chinese herbs is we generally use formulas containing several herbs that have different properties, different effects, as opposed to Western herbology, which is generally you have a sore throat, here, take this herb. And I'm not saying anything bad about Western herbology, but compared to traditional Chinese herbology, it's really in its infancy. So, and occasionally we will just prescribe one single herb, but that's pretty rare. They are almost always in formulas with multiple herbs in them. And of course, we'll cover all of that as we go down the road too. So as we go along here, coming out of the ancient past, this information about herbs and what herb is good for this, or maybe a combination of herbs is good for a cough or whatever it is. If you look at ancient Chinese culture, you see it as a very, very family-oriented culture. And so this information gets concentrated into family lineages and then passed down over the ages. And some of it's common, some of it is more secret, familial, knowledge. Even today, there are folks who have little secrets that they don't like to divulge. I'm speaking of you, Dr. Wu. Thanks for sharing that with me. But eventually, all of this knowledge starts to become codified and written down. And by, it was 111 A.D., the Huang Di Neijing was written. This was the first compendium, the Yellow Emperor's compendium on the medicine, and really the first codified ideas about diseases, causes, treatments, herbs, this sort of thing. But then, just not quite 100 years later, there's a book that is written called the Shanghan Lun. This is written by Dr. Zhang Jing, and difficult name to pronounce, but a very common name. If you go to acupuncture school, traditional Chinese medicine school, you'll hear this name a lot. And just briefly, Zhang Jing's story is, China is in some sense sort of the land of the viruses. They've always been plagued with viruses, emerging viruses, flu viruses, things like this. And of course, we see this recently with this pandemic. Now there are other places. I mean, Ebola comes from Africa. But China does have a lot of viruses and a lot of emerging viruses and stuff, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So they would occasionally have pandemics, epidemics, and pestilence and stuff, and it would sometimes have really devastating effects on the population. And so around 200 A.D. or so, there was a very bad pathogenic outbreak. Now, a lot of times I think we tend to think that it was a flu outbreak, and it could have been. It could have been something else. It could have been something more like the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak. But it was probably a viral pathogen. It could have been bacterial, but almost certainly it was probably viral the way that it happened, because it wiped out huge swaths of the Chinese population. And Zhang Jing lost 200 members of his extended family from this disease. And so he took it upon himself to go out and seek some knowledge, and let's look at the medicine that we have here. Let's codify it so that we can all share the knowledge, and when future things like this happen, we'll be better prepared. This is in 200 A.D., folks. And for practitioners, students, it's a bit difficult text to read. The theory of it is not so hard to grasp after you've been in school for a while, but just actually reading the text, even the translated texts translated into English, are somewhat difficult to read and understand. I'm still working on it after 20 years. So that was a big shifting point for Chinese medicine, because it really began to be thought of as, a body of medicine. And there were some later texts that came along that also helped this process. But by the time you get to the 13th century, you have what is pretty much a standalone medical paradigm. You have a medical model that is pretty comprehensive and addresses many, if not most, of the ailments of men and women, humans. Um, and this goes along for 700 years. This is the primary medicine for China and indeed pretty much all of Southeast Asia there. Other countries have taken this: Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Thailand. They all have their version of what we call traditional Chinese medicine. In fact, you'll sometimes see today an acronym TEAM, T-E-A-M, for traditional East Asian medicine, and not just traditional Chinese medicine. Uh, you know, I I started off, went to school with traditional Chinese medicine, TCM. It's the most common term. Remains to be seen if team takes over. In some ways it is more accurate, but most of it that's practiced is still the Chinese model. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on there with that. But here at Natural Primary Care Channel, we're just going to call it traditional Chinese medicine. And we're going to look at that in the context of conventional Western medicine, which I'm going to call CWM a lot. So if you hear me say CWM, I'm talking about conventional Western medicine. So you have this body of work here that works, great for 700 years. It goes along. And then the Maoist revolution comes. And after winning the revolution, the Communist Party was in a bit of a pickle here. The country was devastated. Everything was in disarray, and the healthcare was non-existent. Western healthcare just barely existed in China at the time. And of course, being godless communists, sorry, they didn't like traditional Chinese medicine. They wanted to be modern. Traditional Chinese medicine, particularly before this time, had a great deal of spiritual content coming out of the Taoist models and the Confucian models, and the powers that be didn't like that. But they needed health care badly for the people. And there was no Western care to speak of. What there was quite crude and rudimentary. And so in order to address this problem, what they did was they rounded up many of the practitioners and ordered them to basically take the spiritual component out of this compendium of work here, truncate it down to a small usable model, and we're going to train lots and lots of people in this, and we're going to send them out into the country to treat people. These folks became known as the barefoot doctors, and I think there were almost 500,000 of them trained, maybe 400,000 or something like that. Now, a lot of the practitioners refused to do this because they were of the opinion, I presume, that you can't take that out of this body of medicine that is centuries and indeed millennia old. And some of them likely went to their deaths refusing to do this. But it did happen, and some people refer to traditional Chinese medicine as truncated communist medicine, because they really did lop off much of some very valuable information. A lot of treatises were burned, books were burned, and so the body of traditional Chinese medicine that we have now is not what it was before that time. Now, in 1950, they made a decision to, because they had been also working on their Western medicine while they're trying to keep people treated and well with the traditional Chinese medicine that they had sort of truncated. And in 1950, they decided, okay, well, what we're going to do is, as we build up our Western medicine here, we're going to have comprehensive medicine. We're going to have a system that utilizes both of these. Number of reasons for that, partially because the culture sort of expects traditional Chinese medicine, but they also recognize the value of aspects of conventional Western medicine as well. And so from 1950 on in China to this day, they use a comprehensive East-West medical system there. So, when talking about what traditional Chinese medicine is and isn't today, we could certainly say that it's a complex medical system that addresses all of the ailments and illnesses that conventional Western medicine does today. In other words, whatever your problem is, we have an idea and a treatment for that. And its efficacy, just like Western medicine, will vary depending on the situation and the patient. But it is a full standalone medical paradigm. Um, it treats everything from the common cold to COVID, cancer, heart disease, things of this nature. Mental disease, metabolic diseases like diabetes. Western medicine, 3 kinds of diabetes. Traditional Chinese medicine, 4 or 5. We tend to break things down a little bit finer. And I mentioned in the introduction video about East and West medicine complementing and filling in for the strengths and weaknesses of the other. Western medicine being very good for acute emergency, heroic medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine being very good for general health, wellness. In a nutshell there. But traditional Chinese medicine also treats acute situation. As I said, China is, they have lots of viruses there. And there's an aspect of traditional Chinese medicine, and this goes back to the Zhang Jing story, where we have herbs and herbal formulas that are antiviral in a way that Western pharmaceuticals are not. Western pharmaceutical antivirals are, well, frankly, there's not that many. Many of them have side effects. It's a problematic sort of thing in Western medicine, whereas in traditional Chinese medicine, a big part of the medicine is dealing with this. And so in that sense, we also deal with an acute emergency heroic type of medicine in that regard. So if you're getting a cold or you think you have the flu, well, let's just leave it at that for the moment, shall we? Get off to your local acupuncturist, and a lot of times you can stop it in its tracks or can alleviate the severity of it. So we're very good at dealing with these sorts of things. And we are going to address the issue, I know, that's sitting there in the back of your mind. We're going to get to that. So what traditional Chinese medicine isn't is, it's not a panacea. It's not a magic bullet. It's not pseudoscience. It's not snake oil. Even though we do have snakes in our pharmacopoeia. Not used in the West, really. Used still in China, I'm sure. But no, we don't use the Aikidon snake or whatever it is. We don't really use that in the West, although I think you can probably get it. Nor is it voodoo, even though we do stick needles in, well, not dolls, but people. Yeah, it's not all the things that a lot of people think it is. And as I also said in the intro video, I'm sometimes shocked at a few people's reactions. They're not just ignorant or curious or have no opinion about TCM. They're just sort of actively hostile about the very idea of it. I still don't quite understand that, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this. So let's talk about conventional Western medicine and traditional Chinese medicine sort of in a mutual context here to some extent. Even more so today than even when I was a kid, several decades ago. Western medicine is very algorithmic now, and it relies very heavily on testing, blood tests, things of this nature. And MDs today follow pretty specific paths from the patient's complaint to a test to results of that test, maybe another test, and they're trying to get at the cellular heart of the matter in many cases. And then they will prescribe a pharmaceutical in most cases, or depending on what it is, surgery or something. But their primary tool in their kit is pharmaceuticals. It's why some of you out there may be taking 10, 15, 20 medications. If you're taking 20 medications, you might want to have your doctor revisit your list of medications. And so that's it, conventional Western medicine. And this is really fine for a lot of things. It's very good for diagnostics because you can really find out, just exactly what is going on here with this person, at least biophysiologically. And so when you go to see your MD, I don't know, he may not ask you more than 4 or 5 questions, maybe a half a dozen questions at the most, maybe. And then send you off to have some x-rays, some blood tests done, etc. Whereas when you go see your local TCM practitioner, if you've never been before, I warn you up front, we ask a lot of questions. I call it the 100 questions. It's not always 100 questions, but there's 100 questions in theory that it could ask you when you come in. And to simplify it, I just kind of start at the top and work my way down. Do you have any headaches? Do you have any visual problems? Is your nose working right? And just work my way down. Do you have heart palpitations? So question after question after question just about the body, and then more questions about your environment, your lifestyle, your family lifestyle. And this is why traditional Chinese medicine is referred to as being holistic, and that we want to take in all of the possible things that could affect this. One thing that Chinese medicine does really well that Western medicine kind of recognizes but doesn't really address, really, is the role of emotions in health. And in traditional Chinese medicine, we attribute specific emotions with certain organs. And just a brief one, this is something we will cover in depth down the road, but just a brief sort of idea here is grief, unrequited grief, chronic sadness, we say it can affect the lungs. Now, from a Western scientific point of view, that sounds pretty funny. But you see it in clinic time and time and time again. Somebody that has chronic lung problems may, not always of course, but there may be this underlying unrequited sadness there and stuff. So each organ has its own emotion. Some seem more clear in terms of things. Anger in liver, this is a this is a very clear one that we see in clinic a lot of times. So to get more into that, we'll start getting our content up about the actual processes of TCM, and we'll talk about how anger can affect your liver qi. Qi, that's another term. Qi, Q-I, qi. We can do a whole show just on qi. So we do have a lot to cover here as we go along here over the weeks, months, years. So we take an observation of the patient. We look at the patients. We look at the patient's complex, and we try to, try to assess what sort of a person is this. Is this a happy person? Is this an angry person? Is this a sad person? And so we get as much information as we can, and we try to distill that into something that we can see that correlates to what their complaint is. I don't know if I explained that very well or not. I think it's interesting that You used to see this a lot more on medical buildings, but you do still see it, you know, such and such medical arts. And medicine, Western medicine used to be referred more, I think, to the medical arts. There's not much art to it anymore, I don't think. Even 30 or 40 years ago when you went to see your MD, I think you put a lot more thought into your particular situation, your particular complaint than they do now. And of course there are exceptions to that. So I don't mean to just be making blanket statements here. And so let's think about what is the art of medicine. There's a type of discernment that we need to get a good diagnosis. In other words, we need to be really discerning and look at the patient and listen to the patient. Then we want to develop, you know, we have a diagnosis now, and we want to develop a treatment methodology. And that's something that, particularly in traditional Chinese medicine, we usually have many options, many paths that we can go down to try to address the situation. And pretty much right now, from now here on out, certainly for this program, we're talking about herbs here. So you have, you know, different herbs, different formulas that you might be able to apply. But, you know, most situations, somebody comes in and they complain of a cold, or they complain, you know, of maybe they have diabetes, they want to, you know, cut back, or they want, you know, they're having problems with their medications that they're taking or whatever. In order to get to the best treatment methodology, we want to have treatments that we say are elegant, in the sense that we want to be able to address the problem in the most simple, effective way. So instead of giving somebody 3 formulas, if I can manage it, I just want to give them 1 formula. So this is something else that maybe your typical MDs don't spend a lot of time thinking about these days. As I said, you know, there are exceptions here. So let's just go back for a minute to Zhang Jing. Let me give me a little sip of tea here. I'll try not to bump the microphone. Zhang Jing wrote this book. It's the treatise on cold disorders. And if you get a cold, or you get the flu, very often it follows a very distinct pattern. You start off with maybe chills and body aches. It's cold. You feel cold. And then as time goes by, you know, a few days, it gets warmer and warmer and warmer and hotter. So you have chills, no fever, body aches, and then you may develop chills and fever, and that can eventually develop into fever with no chills. So there are stages to this viral disease, the common cold, which, by the way, is a coronavirus, just like SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV-1. The common cold is a coronavirus. And this is not the place to talk about virology, but we're going to talk about virology a little bit here. This is informative to us, these stages, because we attribute certain properties to herbs. Certainly one of the aspects that we attribute to herb is about temperature. Is it a warming herb? Is it a cooling herb? So if you have chills, I don't want to give you an herb that's cold or an herb that's cooling. I want to give you an herb that's warming because you're cold. Or if you have fever and no chills, maybe I want to give you a cool herb to help cool. Now, here in the West, we sort of automatically think, when we think about medicine, we automatically just think about pills and pharmaceuticals and everything. And we don't think about things like, is this pharmaceutical hot or cold or anything? So in some sense, herbal medicine is much more complicated than pharmaceutical medicine, if you want to do it correctly. So let me turn the pages on my note here a little bit. As I said, we are going to talk a little bit about virology here, and more specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. This is a mess, to put it mildly. As far as I'm concerned, this thing has been bungled from the very beginning. And so there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of disinformation. We live in a time where anybody can say anything and get it out to the public. So I've seen, heard some pretty strange ideas about what the virus is. In fact, I've heard some that were just, just crazy, and so we're not going to go into any of those possibilities. Here's what I'm going to assume, okay, for the sake of addressing, treating, and so forth. The best information that I have been able to find is that this is a virus that likely came from some bats in a cave. There were some coal miners several years ago that came down, I don't know, it was 10 or 11 of them, and they all came down with this sort of odd pneumonia. And people think about China as being some backwards country, and I mean, in the rural parts it is, but this is a very highly technical culture here. And they don't just ignore things, they don't, it's not like they don't care about public health. Of course they care about their public health. And so if somebody reports, we have this group of miners here that has this type of pneumonia and we can't really figure out what's going on, well, the government will send a health team out to try to figure it out, So they were able to isolate a virus from these coal miners. Several of them died. And this virus was eventually ended up in the lab in Wuhan. Now, these virology labs here, as far as I know, there were 2 labs on the whole planet that had this SARS-CoV virus. And one was in Wuhan, and the other one is in Georgia, North Carolina, somewhere here. I can't remember. One's here in the United States, one's in Wuhan. These are international labs. The lab in Wuhan is administered by the Chinese. The lab here in the United States is administered by the United States. But they are international labs. They have international staffs working there. So it looks like they had this virus in the lab, and they want to study the virus. And virology is a very strange subject to begin with, because they're tiny, tiny, tiny little things. You can't really see them, so much of your research and everything is done on, I think, perhaps fairly tenuous theories. It takes a while to tease out the signal from the noise in virology, I think. And so now you've taken a virus from its natural location. I'm sorry, I just don't believe the wet market hypothesis. I think that's pretty much been debunked. But if you take a virus out of its natural environment, which is a bat that lives in a cave, and you stick it in a laboratory where you have ultraviolet lights, you have a controlled temperature, I mean, it's a completely different environment. And remember that viruses can evolve extremely rapidly. So with even maybe just a few years, 2 or 3 years, whatever, this virus could have just evolved into something much different than the original bat virus. And plus, according to Brett Weinstein and Yuri Dagin, this virus has what they call a ferrin site on it. And to not get into the genetics of that or the meaning of that, what it is it is essentially a set of skeleton keys for the virus. In other words, if you have a virus that you want to study, well, you want to do things to your virus, tweak it, insert other genetic material, whatever, and then you want to put this into a cell host to see what it does. This is not always an easy thing to do. And so by attaching a ferrin site, that's ferrin is in ferrous like iron, and by attaching a ferrin site to the outside of this virus, it allows it to, if it comes into contact with just for the sake of discussion here, say a lung cell, and it can't get in, then it'll maybe bump into another one where it can. It's like, remember that the coronavirus has those spikes all over it. At the end of these spikes are chemicals that when they bump into a cell, it's like putting a key in a lock, and if it fits, the cell opens and the virus gets inside. And so most viruses have just one way to get into a cell, but if you're studying a virus and you can essentially hand it a set of chemical skeleton keys, you now have a virus that it can get into all kinds of different cells much easier. And this could explain, I think, some of the various odd symptoms about the SARS-CoV-2 virus that you don't see in something like an influenza patient. Like the weird blood coagulation and some other symptoms and stuff. This could explain why this virus affects different sorts of organs in different people. So as I said at the beginning of this is a very, weird thing to talk about. Lots of confusing information. Even the powers that be have contradicted themselves. I'm not even going to get into the vaccine thing. We'll just see how it goes along here. So the idea that you have a culture that's been dealing with emerging viruses for thousands of years and has developed a very broad and deep herbal treatment for these things. And then you look at the fact that in China, also in Taiwan, they have this comprehensive medicine. They have this East-West model. Then you would expect that, say, the hospital in Wuhan would also be using Chinese herbs as well as Western medicine to treat these patients. And as it turns out, of course, they do, and they did. Right after, it must have been towards the end of March, first part of April. I have to go back and check and see. We finally did get some information here in the West via Dr. John Chen, who is an amazing, brilliant individual. He's the go-to guy for herb-drug interactions. In addition to being an attorney, and a doctor of Oriental medicine, he also has a PhD in pharmacology. So if you want to know anything about how herbs interact with pharmaceuticals, contact John Chen. But he had some contacts in the hospital in Wuhan and managed to get this information out, and the formula that they were using in the hospital there in Wuhan, a Qingfei Baidutang formula. And did a webinar, I think this thing ran almost 3 hours. Lots of stats about the hospital, the way that it was used, different hospitals using it. If you're a TCM practitioner and you have not seen this webinar, go watch it immediately. If you are not a practitioner and you want to see something that, mind you, you won't understand hardly any of it, but one thing that it will show you is the rigor and depth that we use in Chinese medicine. And I think all practitioners of TCM understand and realize that it is a science. It's perhaps a slightly different science than conventional Western medicine, but it is nonetheless a science. And so he gave us the formula, and I was a little surprised, and in some ways not surprised, because there's a very big formula, 20 or 21 herbs in this formula. Most herb formulas are 2 or 3 up to 5 or 6, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 is a big formula. A formula that has 20 herbs in it is a big formula. And I can understand why they would make a big formula. They're trying to address something that is an emerging virus, don't know much about it. You deal with the symptoms the patient presents, and the complications of all of that. When you have great herbal minds thinking about it, you're very likely to come up with something that is fairly large. So once I got over my initial shock of how big the formula was, and I started to think about it, I said, yes, this kind of makes sense here. And he also talked about the formula that the hospital workers, doctors, nurses, etc., use to sort of help prevent becoming infected. And it's actually based on a formula that's been around for a very long time. When cold and flu season rolls around in China, if you think you're getting a little sniffle, or you're around people that are a little sniffly, you may pop down to the local drugstore and pick you up some jade windscreen. And it's a formula to sort of prevent colds and flu. Now, in Western medicine, if you make a claim like that, you have to be able to back that up. Well, in TCM it's the same thing. It's true. You can't just say something like that if there's not good hard evidence to show that this is effective. And by the way, those stats are on this webinar as well. So we're distributing that formula for the healthcare workers, and then using the Qingfei Baidutan to treat patients. And it gets very complicated because you modify the formula for the different patient and so forth. And if you hang in with us and follow us down the road here, and we really get into the heart of the herbal medicine and so forth, you'll begin to see, how all of that works. That's why I say herbal medicine is in many ways, I think, far more complicated than pharmaceutical medicine. Let's see, let me check my notes here just to make sure I'm in the right space. Got it. Okay. So when the pandemic first hit, and John Chin did this webinar, this channel was supposed to have actually started right about that time. But just not quite there, 2-3 weeks out from trying to get the channel going when this thing happened. And so I just threw up some quick videos on the Qingfei Baidutan, did them off the top of my head. If any of you saw them, I apologize. I know they were not very good. Because I wanted people to be aware of it, and I also wanted to make this available to people. And this formula is available to people. And this formula is available to people through us. Now, I'm not urging everybody to run out and get this formula necessarily. It's the sort of thing that, for certain people, it could make sense to have this formula on hand. And that's strictly a judgment call on your part. But here's where it could come in useful. If you or a loved one or a friend contracts the coronavirus and comes down with COVID-19, depending on the situation, depending on the conventional Western medical situation, you might be able to integrate that formula into the treatment. I wouldn't recommend doing it, however, without some supervision or some input from a practitioner. Your local practitioner may or may not have access to this formula depending on how they operate their clinic. So we're willing to provide the formula to people, but we do recommend that it's a formula that you're just, it's sitting on your shelf, and if you need it, something happens and you think that you need it, you can then take it to a local practitioner and say, okay, look, I have the Qingfei Paidu Tang, here's my situation, how do we proceed here? That's our first recommendation. If you're not able to do that, if you don't have access to that, then you can email us and say, look, here's my situation, I've already got the formula. And you're going to want to have the formula on hand because it can take a week or two to get the formula. So if you come down and you're ill with this, better to have the formula up front, because by the time it gets to you, it may not be as effective or not. It may not be an opportune time to give it. So we will make that accessible to people. But the thing I do kind of strongly want to recommend is our modified Jade Screen formula. If you're a healthcare worker, if you're working in a place where there's lots of people, if you have to work with the public and you're not able to work from home and continue social distancing or whatever, this is a formula that I would recommend that people take. And in terms of its actions and functions from a Western perspective, it's an immune system booster, is perhaps the easiest way to describe it. So our modified Jade windscreen, I do recommend to everyone. So if you want the Qingfei Baidu Tan, we can provide you for that. However, you would need to become an online herb clinic patient for that. In other words, you would need to register and then fill out the 100-question form and become an online clinic patient to get the Qingfei Baidu Tan. But anybody can have access to the Jade windscreen. So if you go to our website at naturalprimarycare.clinic, remember that's .clinic, the original Natural Primary Care, naturalprimarycare.clinic, you can see those formulas there in our gallery and have a look at them. And I also mentioned Taiwan. It uses what we call comprehensive medicine. And it's really interesting there because their level of conventional Western medicine is very high for the average citizen. Whereas in China, conventional Western medicine, the level is very high for people that have power and money. As you go down the social scale, that level of Western medical safety and efficacy drops a little bit. But in Taiwan, it's basically there across the social spectrum. And Taiwan is also a place where we source almost all of our Chinese herbs here in the West. They come from Taiwan or through Taiwan. And just one big thing here about Chinese herbs, the herbs that we're using here in the West are tested to the nth degree from one end to the other. There's some reports out there about Chinese herbs being contaminated. We want to separate these particular custom-made Chinese herb formulas with what we call patent medicines, which would be like an over-the-counter medicine, like the Chinese equivalent of an Advil or something that you could just buy in a convenience store. Some of those patent medicines, Chinese patent medicines, had been found to contain adulterants and heavy metals, and in one case I even had some pharmaceuticals in it. Most of these things are not available here in the United States. Certainly the ones that were found to be contaminated are not available here in the United States. And all of the herbs that we make our formulas from are tested at the source. They're tested before they leave China. They're tested when they get to Taiwan. They're tested before they manufacture them. They're tested after they manufacture them. They're tested before they ship them out. They're tested when they get to the United States. So they're tested, like I said, to the nth degree for pesticides, adulterants, heavy metals, anything outside of what should be in just the herb. And so this is one reason why traditional Chinese herbal medicine here in the West is very, very safe, as well as being efficacious. So that's that for that. One other thing here, and I don't know if I was going to talk about this or not, but I am just going to mention it briefly. Going back to when this started, I had a realization and a bit of a fear, because I realized that the first numbers about this thing were, of course, coming out of Wuhan. And so once the virus was out of China and started to spread, it's getting into, like, Italy was hit very hard, and we're looking at those numbers, the Chinese numbers were considerably lower, certainly per capita. And then a lot of people said, oh, well, they're just lying, and these can't be the real numbers. Well, look, I can grant you that in Chinese scientific research, numbers do get fudged, but it's an interesting culture. They had this thing called face, which we don't understand here in the West, and it has to do with ego and embarrassment and all sorts of inner emotions with people. You're not supposed to embarrass people. You're not supposed to insult people. So, this is one reason why some of the Chinese research isn't, considered rigorous in the West, because maybe you can't trust the numbers exactly. But for that culture, it sort of kind of works, because it's kind of built into the system. And so it's kind of, everybody knows. In other words, they don't do it willy-nilly. Okay, if they say we have 100,000 cases, do they have, is it 100,000 cases? Maybe. Could it be 200,000 cases? Maybe. Could it be 300,000 or 400,000 cases? No. Because, well, it's just not how they would do it. If it was 400,000 cases, the official number would be more like 200,000. So, do they do it? Yes. In my opinion, they don't do it willy-nilly. So I think that you can trust the Chinese numbers as long as you understand that about them. But no matter how you slice it, when you look at a per capita basis, both China and Taiwan have very low transmission numbers and confirmed diagnosis numbers and death numbers compared to the West. And my conclusion is, and I predicted this back then, is that it would be worse in the West because we don't have the comprehensive medicine. We don't have this East-West synergistic approach to this. And so the fact that, they're treating it with the best Western, ventilators and everything else that they can, but they're also using this very ancient Chinese concept of how you go about treating a virus with particular plant materials. And when you plug that into the formula, you're going to get better outcomes. That's what I think. To nail it down for the numbers, to do the research, maybe somewhere down the line in a year or two we'll have better ideas about, the veracity of that observation that I have, but that certainly is what it looked like to me. So I mentioned the Qing Fei Pai Du Tang and what you can do if you have that, and that's about building your own comprehensive medical system. You may live in a place where there are no TCM practitioners, and it's perfectly fine for you to go to your MD and say, hey, look, doc, here's what I'm on about. Right? This is what's really important to me in terms of my health care. And I would really appreciate it if you can find a way to work with me on this. If, for instance, maybe you're diabetic, your drugs aren't working, or the side effects are unbearable, or, this is it could be any disease, okay? If you go to your doctor and say, look, I'd like to try this, then they should be able to say, oh, okay, well,
yes, no, maybe, I recommend it, I don't recommend it. You're going to get answers all across the board depending on your doctor and where you are. But you have the right to do it. And I think you should do it. You should not be afraid to confront, maybe that's not the right word, you should not be afraid to address this with your MD or DO. If you know them fairly well and you have a relationship with them, maybe it's a little bit easier. Many people don't know their doctors at all. Their doctors don't remember them from the last time they were there. They're looking strictly at a chart. Maybe they remember, maybe they don't. Your typical MD practice, MD might have, 1,000, 2,000 patients on his books. You can't remember all of that. And so if you want to have some comprehensive medicine in your life, it's kind of going to be up to you to try to implement that and try to get your MD to work with you. If you won't do it and you think there's somebody else down the road that might, shop around. Of course, the best thing to do is, if you do live in a place that has a TCM practitioner or practitioners, shop around, find one that you like, and start with that and get them to help you. Now again, we're people too. We have different opinions and stuff. I have colleagues that just, don't want to think about Western medicine, don't want to work with them, don't want to have anything to do with it. They want their patients to eschew Western medicine. That's not my opinion, and that's not how I work. So try to find a TCM practitioner that's willing to, work with you to build a comprehensive medical system, if not for your community, at least for yourself. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about here before I let you guys go? Let me have another sip here. I had some stuff here about level of education and degrees and stuff, but I think we're going to hold up most of that for most time. But just to let everybody know, the level of education for a quote-unquote acupuncturist, a doctor of Oriental medicine, an acupuncture physician, a licensed acupuncturist, these are all different appellations that vary from state to state. But keep in mind, regardless of the school that you go to, you study a standard curriculum, and then when it's all over, you take a standardized national test. This test is administered to every practicing practitioner in the country. So the national test is the standard. The appellation varies from state to state, unlike medical doctors. For instance, in Florida, I'm a doctor of Oriental medicine. We do primary care, and an acupuncture physician. They give you a sort of list. It's kind of like choose whichever one you like. And that appellation is not directly related to your degree, which is somewhat interesting, but it's the way that it is. It's one of the things that we need to change. So while I'm a doctor of Oriental medicine in Florida, if I go to Kansas or Texas or Louisiana or someplace, I'm probably going to be a licensed acupuncturist, maybe an acupuncture physician. So the fact that these appellations vary from state to state, and our scope of practice varies from state to state, as I said, in Florida, we're primary care physicians. It's in our scope of practice. Traditional Chinese medicine is a form of primary care. In Texas, where we have some affiliates, that is licensed acupuncturist. And so, it's not very flattering term, really. And it doesn't really cover what we do. What if you have a practice and you don't even do acupuncture? You're a licensed acupuncturist, but you only do herbs? So, there's lots of things about our scope of practice, our national standards, our state standards, what we're called, what our degrees are called, that needs to be changed. It needs to be generalized. It needs to be put into a sensible form. It's ridiculous to have all of this variety out there because it confuses people as to what we do, confuses people to our level of education, which, by the way, I have to say is 4 to 5 years with 2 years undergraduate work. So in some cases, 2 years undergraduate, mostly in science, should be. There's a certain number of science hours that you have to have just to get into school. Then you're going to do 4 years of school, and you might even do another year or so if you want to have a little bit of an extra edge on folks. I took an extra year of herbal medicine just because I felt like by the time I got out of school, I had focused so much on acupuncture and some other elements. I really needed another year of herbal medicine so that I could, really feel that I understood the full body of work there. So that's 5 years on top of 2 years. That's 7 years to become a licensed acupuncturist, a doctor of Oriental medicine. So it's not a fluffy thing, It's about the same for MDs. Which, by the way, remember that MDs are not, in the strictest sense, doctors, perhaps. If we reserve the term doctor for PhDs only, then not. So there's a lot of unfairness across the board there as well, perhaps. Your MD degree is a master's degree plus a little bit, a master's degree plus an internship, basically. So I would certainly say that, and the very few MDs that have taken the full TCM course, I think will all agree. And there's there's not very many that have ever done it. But I think they will agree that it's every bit as rigorous and difficult as studying Western medicine. It's grueling. It takes over your entire life. And at the end of it, you are absolutely exhausted. There's just, you will not get to the end of traditional Chinese medicine school and not feel that you deserve a long vacation. So it's why it's very rigorous. And I think that's everything for my notes there. I just want to thank everybody for hanging in there, watching this so far. As I said in the introduction video, we're going to have lots of content. Some of it's going to be short, some of it's going to be long. We'll just have to wait and see as it goes down there. But now for the closing remarks. Thanks. Visit our website, naturalprimarycare.clinic. That's the original Natural Primary Care. Email us at naturalprimarycare@gmail.com. That's the way to get a hold of us. And of course, subscribe, like, leave a comment, ask a question. We'll try to get back to you. And stay tuned. So that's it for right now. I'm Dr. Wes. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye.